if did you want to go on to the Bolivian team before? Or
Sure. Yeah. I know you've said that there's very little, I guess, evidence, I guess, written evidence by the Bolivian national team as far as their World Cup adventure, and so basically, you're saying no books have been written, or very little, or just no Bolivian
I
sources, or
there are some publications on Bolivian football that do make reference to the first World Cup, but very little seems to be contained in them. But there's a few articles you can find online which don't. It's not very great detail, but yeah, there is a lack of evidence information out there. I did come across one article the other day, which is it's only recently been published online, which is actually gives a lot more information, which I was surprised to come across. But the Bolivian team was primarily based around players from this region in Bolivia called Oruro, and there was about 8 players from this region that was in the team, and there was 3 from another region called Potosi, 3 from La Paz, and 2 from Cochabamba, if that's the right pronunciation. But this article that I just come across the other day it's one of the better articles I found on Bolivian football. Apparently most of the players in this team would actually would later go and fight in the Chaco War against Paraguay, and we know that one of the Paraguayan players, Aurelio Gonzalez, he turned
down an offer from I guess I believe Vélez Sarsfield, so that he would.
It was an it was an Argentinian team. Yeah, and I know you wrote about on your blog. Yeah, right. And you're probably right about Vélez Sarsfield, and so several of these players would fight in the Chaco War. Sorry.
One thing about Bolivian, I think it's a very interesting gesture they did in their very first match to pay homage to, I guess, their Uruguayan hosts, is that each player had a letter of the alphabet on their jersey, such that with 11 letters that it would spell Viva Uruguay. And like any story around that gesture, why they came up with it or how they came up and all that, because it's interesting when you think about it, especially at the time, they would
absolutely, like and I can come to that in a second, but just a little bit more information about the background of the Bolivian team is that they would actually train for about a month in the city of Oruro, which was a mining and economic capital of the country, and it would take them about a week to travel to Montevideo. They weren't the last to arrive because there was actually a revolution going on in Bolivia at the time, and it wasn't too sure if they would actually go. And eventually, I think they were one of the last teams to arrive, and it was only after the president sanctioned their apparently their journey. Perhaps that was based on the borders being closed. I don't know, during this revolutionary period, maybe, or had to do with funds as well. It's not too clear, but it would take. They left Oruro by train for a place called Villazon, and they continued on their way to Buenos Aires, where they crossed the boat to Uruguay, and it took them about a week to get there, apparently, or a few days, I should say. But before we get into that famous picture that we see of those, I did find out a little bit more about their coach, Ulises Saucedo, who was also
a referee as well.
Yeah, and many of the teams were asked to try and provide a referee for the competition because they wanted as many referees as they could, because they couldn't really just have Uruguayan referees. So no other referees from countries that did not participate in the competition actually refereed in the World Cup. So all the referees that took part in the World Cup came from the countries taking part in it. So, so that's one aspect. But there's been a couple of stories that he'd gone to he'd emigrated to England, where apparently one source says he went to play football, and that he played professionally, but records pertaining to him playing professional football have been very hard to come by. And he also apparently had a coaching role at Arsenal. And so I'd found this reference to Arsenal quite intriguing, and they would also always appear in these online articles, and you're never too sure about the validity of them. And then I came across an article. Then I come across an article in a Chilean newspaper, El Mercurio, that was dated on the 17th of July 1930. So it's from the period in time, and it's an interview with the Bolivian Federation president, and he states that they called Salcedo back from England to come and take charge of the Bolivian team, as well as the governing body that was responsible for physical education in Bolivia. And the coach, the Federation president, states that he had his coaching role at Arsenal. So what I did, I contacted Arsenal about this claim, and apparently this isn't the first inquiry they've had about Salcedo. And the historian at Arsenal is a man named Ian Cook, and he was very helpful on the subject. He stated that they could not find any record of Salcedo at Arsenal, but what he did say is that at this period in time, that much of the newspaper coverage at this time really only focused on the team and the coach, the manager, and the manager at the time was Herbert Chapman. And apparently Herbert Chapman apparently at the time would this is what the historian Ian Cook described him. He said he was one of the great managers in British football, and also a major innovator who spoke to coaches from other countries, and because he invited others coaches from other countries to come and watch Arsenal playing and training. So he says it is entirely possible that he would that Ulises Salcedo may have spent time at Arsenal learning the trade of coaching. So while we have no concrete evidence that he had a coaching role at Arsenal, it is entirely possible that he did. And because it comes from the Bolivian Federation president, we don't have any reason really to doubt him, really. So it's interesting that there's this Arsenal connection with the Bolivian coach in the first World Cup. But going to that famous photograph of the Brazilian team against, not the Brazilian, the Bolivian team against Yugoslavia. Many of the countries, because obviously Uruguay was quite far off, and compared to the 1928 Olympics, where there was this massive attraction for the average fan in Holland, that it was the Olympic Games in 1928 was a big money spinner for the hosts. They had, I think one source, I think you may know this, there was like a request for 200,000 tickets for the final alone, I believe, between Uruguay and Argentina. There was that much demand, and and not only other fans from other countries that surrounded the Netherlands would go to the Olympics, but for Uruguay, it was far off. So not many fans from other countries went to the World Cup to see their team. I think it was only really the Argentinian fans that would go. You may have had a few Chileans and a few Brazilians there, but there was actually quite Montevideo. It was obviously, it had its own little colonies of immigrant colonies that so there was a small Peruvian colony. About one list says there was about 51 Peruvians living in Montevideo at the time, and I'm not sure how many Bolivians there were, but so if any sort of fans from other countries went to see their team perform in the World Cup, there would have probably been immigrants living in Montevideo. But what many of the teams did, in order to try and drum up local support, they would invariably, a lot of the teams would carry out the Uruguayan flag onto the pitch. So you can find a photograph of the United States team carrying a Uruguayan flag onto the pitch. The Mexicans doing the same. But what the Bolivians did, they decided that they would put the letters of Uruguay and the letters of Viva Uruguay, and this was designed primarily just to drum up local support. You know, to get behind the team. Right. But there is another. So there's that famous photograph, but there's also one photograph that shows them that instead of saying Viva Uruguay, it says Viva Uruguay, because one of the users missing.
Right. The team picture, the one player was missing. The picture,
I believe that player that was missing was Guillermo Gomez. Now he would ultimately have his leg broken in that match in the 8th minute of the game. But the reason why he missed this photo, was apparently because he had a sudden bout of diarrhea before the game and he had to be in the toilet. So that's why we have this
famous
this missing you are gay, Viva you are gay. So that's the reason why when you see those 10 players in that picture. But again, like I said, the information on the Bolivian team is very sparse in that respect, and there's not very much info on that. And ultimately, in their first game, they got beat by the Yugoslavs 4-0, and Guillermo Gomez broke his leg in the 8th minute, and I think he ended up staying in Uruguay for about several weeks after. I found a photograph to recuperate, and I've actually found a photograph of him in a wheelchair and with a walking stick, and one photograph of him in bed being visited by some of the Uruguayan players. But he would stay in Uruguay, where the rest of the team would eventually return home.
Right.
But so the information on the Bolivian team is very hard to come by, and while this whole research process of trying to figure out what went on in Uruguay, it's been facilitated in much more in recent years by the fact that you are able to access a lot of newspapers online, archived, been digitized.
Right.
You know, there is no digitized archives of newspapers to be found online for the Bolivia. So it would require actually going to Bolivia to look through any of the papers, and even in that scenario, you may only find information about their pre-World Cup training preparations, because I don't think a Bolivian journalist actually went on the journey. So many of the Bolivian papers would have been
there's second-hand, third-hand news, basically.
Well, they would be picking up the cablegrams from some of the major news agencies at the time, like Associated Press, the United Press, Agencia Americana was a South American press agency. So and even then, a lot of them would be edited, so much edited that you'd find invariably only short paragraphs of the information, or ones that didn't go into too much detail, really, because that's just how the nature of some newspapers. If you can look in the Argentinian press, and they covered it extensively. You know, the way the reports were written were very much like as if you were reading a radio transcript of the game, because they would every scenario, situation that would happen, they would write it down and then dispatch it. They would have someone there to go and dispatch it via cablegram, and invariably all these cablegrams would be collected at the end and printed as a news report, as a match report, and so, for instance, La Prensa, the Argentinian newspaper La Prensa, would sometimes dedicate sort of 2 large broadsheets to each game. Not all games, maybe only one broadsheet, but you're talking several thousand words each for each game. So the event was very much covered in the Argentinian press, Uruguayan press, and Brazilian press. And while I don't have much, I have a few articles. I've some access to Uruguayan newspapers, which I haven't fully processed and translated yet. There still might be a little bit of information in there about the Bolivian team as well. So, like I said, the information on Bolivia is very sparse. The Bolivian performances, again, I think I've written elsewhere about and spoken elsewhere about their first game against Yugoslavia, and they were summarily beaten 4-0 in that game. They lost a player in the 8th minute. Gumachindo Gomez had his leg broken in a challenge with Ivkovic, and they managed to still last the rest of the half goalless until and eventually the Yugoslavs would overcome them and score 4 goals, and the floodgates open up. And so, and if anyone's interested in learning a little bit more about that game, I've actually got a blog, a post on my blog called Unlucky Bolivia or False History, and it goes to this this idea that some modern publications have stated that Bolivia had 4 goals disallowed. I've seen the reference to several goals disallowed in one book as well. On Wikipedia it says that the Bolivians had several goals disallowed, but the post on my blog actually goes into detail why I don't think that's true. But anyway, so they lost 4-0 to the Yugoslavs. Yugoslavia would then go on to beat Brazil 2-1 in that group, because they were in a group 2 with Yugoslavia and Brazil. And so when they came to play Brazil in the last game, they were already out, and both teams were already out. And they played, and this is where they were played at the Estadio Centenario, and I think it was, some estimates have around 9,000 people at the game. Some estimates say 24,000. It was played on the same day as the Paraguay v Belgium game, so it wasn't, the stadium was never full to capacity. There's one interesting anecdote about that game, in that because Brazil in this area wore white shirts and with a blue collar, I believe, and Bolivia wore white shirts as well. And there's that a little antidote that apparently the game was stopped after about a few minutes, I believe, and I think you might have mentioned this in your blog as well, but because they couldn't distinguish between the two teams, and the Bolivians had to wear I'm not sure where they got the kit from, but they had to change into a blue shirt, and I'm not sure if
I thought it was from what I read, it was like Uruguay's jerseys, right? The celeste, the light blue, the sky blue, I should say.
Yeah. Some of the accounts I read aren't entirely clear, and it does say Uruguay shirts. Others say maybe it was a club team, but again, as you say, they are described as blue shirts, so it would make sense if it was they were playing in Uruguay shirts. But wearing the blue shirts of Uruguay obviously didn't help them out in that game, because they were again thrashed 4-0. So